Good evening and welcome to Bookmarked. This is our third session of 2023. We're looking to have a great evening here with author Jim McClure. And before I forget, my name is Caroline Smith. I am our manager of public programs here at the History Center, and we have some upcoming events that I think you all might be interested in. The first is actually this coming Friday, our first Friday of September, which we will be highlighting our new cemeteries and churches walking tour. So that'll be a free 30-minute walking tour here in downtown York. And then on the 15th of September, we have our Spirits of the Past. We will be focusing in on Oktoberfest and tying it to our German roots here in Pennsylvania. So that'll be a great program that is ticketed. And looking ahead to our program this evening and tying it to colonial America, I do want to just let folks know November 18th will be our Articles of Confederation Day celebration. So we hope to see you all there in person if you're able to attend. So I'm going to hand it over to Scott, and we can get this program kicked off.
Good evening. Tonight we welcome Jim McClure, who many of you probably remember as the editor of the York Daily Record, the York Sunday and the York Sunday News, and associated digital products since May of 2004. Jim retired on April 1st of 2019 after 30 years with YDR. Jim is the author or co-author of 7 books on York County history, among them Never to Be Forgotten, a year-by-year look at York County's past. And the book we're going to talk about tonight, 9 Months in Yorktown, American Revolutionaries' Labor on Pennsylvania's Frontier. With Scott Menges, he has also co-authored Civil War Voices from York County and Echoing Still More Civil War Voices from York County. Jim is a prolific contributor to our York community. He serves as the chairperson for the York County History Center's Publications Committee. He served as the general editor of the 3-volume 250th Chronicles, published in conjunction with the 250th anniversary of York County in 1999. He also contributes to the Writers' Roundtable, a quarterly meeting of researchers who write about the history of York County. Most recently, Jim received the Legion of Honor Award from the Fort Chaplains Memorial of York County. Although retired, Jim contributes a weekly column in the Sunday News and has an online presence at Retro York Facebook, witnessingyork.com, and Hometown History. So welcome, Jim.
Great to be here. Thanks for throwing this party tonight.
Well, Jim, let's jump into it. Your book, 9 Months in Yorktown, can you take us back in time? What was your motivation for writing this book?
Yeah, there were several things. One was that and Scott Mingus does a good job of this. Whenever you're thinking about doing a book, I guess it makes sense that you look and see what's been done in the past, and then you try to write something that hasn't been done in the past. And I noticed that there hadn't been a full-fledged book on the American Revolution in York County. York County contribute to that master's work, and I noticed that. And the other thing was that after 1999, my Never Forgotten was kind of part of the 250th York County anniversary. And if you can tie your books to an anniversary, then it benefits the anniversary committee, which always wants books in connection with those. And it also benefits the visibility of your work. So my first 5 books were all tied to something going on in the community. And 9 Months in Yorktown was tied. I knew that the 225th of the adoption of the Artisan Federation was coming up. So I got the book out ahead of that as part of that. The other thing that I realized early at that time, and still believe it's the case, if you're going to do history in your county, there's 2 things that you need to make sure that you have a grasp on. And one of them is the religions in your county, the different denominations, the importance of religion in your county's past. And the other one was the American Revolution. And so if you look back, you look at the greats of the past, Jim Rudisill and Charlie Gladfelder and Henry Young. They had those ideas and they had those mastered. And you look at the best historians today, Jonathan Stayer and June Lloyd, and both of them have that down really well. So I knew I had to get a grasp on both of those. I had the religion thing pretty well in hand, but I really had to bone up on the American Revolution. And so all those things kind of came together. I think it also at that time in the community, we just had this wonderful 250th anniversary of York County's founding in 1999. Then we had the race riot trials, which was a wrenching thing in the community. So I believe that the community really needed a celebration, and the community really got behind this, even though a 225th anniversary of the Artists Confederation isn't a real sexy anniversary, but the community really got behind it because we needed a celebration at that time. And I think that helped propel the whole thing. So a lot went on in terms of getting this out.
So Jim, this is not just a standard history book. This isn't just a retelling of what happened. And you say actually in your introduction, you use the metaphor of a river. And I'm going to read this quote here. You say, 9 months in Yorktown keeps a clear eye on the river banks. The river of Congress is teeming with events, but crowding the banks are rich stories of its members' lives and those who live beside them. So you don't limit this story to just the 64 delegates, but you also intertwine the lives of York Countyans who were also impacted by this. Can you share with us kind of the research process and also the motivation for including the day-to-day observations and lives of York Countyans in this story?
Yeah, whenever you're doing one of these, then you really search as to how best to tell the story. And so I noticed in terms of the structure, I noticed that early on that it was 271 days that Continental Congress was in New York. Really important, that is a 9-month period. It's actually parts of 10 months, but 9 calendar months covering 4 seasons. So I was able to break it down into 4 seasons: fall retreat, winter discontent, spring anew, and then glorious summer. And so in the way that there's about, I think, at least 6 of us who are active in the local history community who have masters or PhDs from Penn State, Harrisburg, and they tend to be in American Studies. And American Studies really does the training there, really education there is you really try to flatten things out instead of doing a tops down, date driven type of thing. You really try to tell stories in the vernacular, or really divided. You try to look for to make sure you're inclusive of stories according to race, gender, ethnicity, and class. And so whenever I've done the books and all the books, and that's in all the stuff I do, I'm always looking for just not the tops down stuff, the leaders, but also the people that are really living in the community. So that's kind of the way I looked at it. If you think about the 4 chapters I mentioned: fall retreat, winter discontent, spring anew, and glorious summer, what that suggests is a progression. So really Continental Congress was kicked out of Philadelphia by the British, and they came here to York. And we can talk about this. We can unravel this as we go. They came here to York, and they came here very much in disarray. I call them struggling. They came here struggling. And by the time they were ready to go back to Philadelphia 9 months later, they were strutting. So there was a nice story arc there. The country really had come together, and we'll talk about why and how it came together here. And it really was a great moment in our history. I mentioned earlier that we have to know, if you're doing history in your county, you really have to understand our American Revolution past. Now, the Civil War in many ways has eclipsed this. The American Revolution has really the interesting most people in York County, most history people in York County. But and you might say, well, how do you know that? I'll just point to the slide that's in front of me here, that's in front of us here. This is the 250th anniversary slide mural that's still there on West Market Street. So this was kind of the signature of the 250th committee, 1999. And look what they have in the middle of it. It's an American Revolution theme. And so, and if you look at the murals of York, which are those 18 large scale panels that are still on the sides of buildings, really the first kind of murals of program. They've been in the news a lot recently, a lot more murals, but these were the original 18. And if you look at the 18, 3 of them covered the American Revolution, 3 of them World War II. And this was in 2001, 2002. There's only one small mural that connected as a mini mural connecting to the Civil War. So you can tell the values of the community at the turn of the millennium was around this World War II past, of course, but still was around the American Revolution past. So all that tied together, to try to tell that story at this time that the community needed a good story to tell.
And I think too, as York Countyans, we are very proud of the fact that we played a part in the birth of our nation. But to understand that, we have to talk about the Articles of Confederation, and we need to then understand how they connect to the Declaration of Independence, to the treaties with France. So can you help us with some context and how these important documents and the founding of our nation all can come together here?
Yeah, this is kind of a quick and dirty graphic. I use it all the time because I can understand it at least. This shows kind of the scope of the American Revolution, starting in 1770 with the Boston massacre, and that involved the death of Crispus Attucks, and of course that's a name dear to us here in New York, which is part of the celebration coming up that we can understand him more. And then in 1775, we had the beginning of the Revolutionary War, the shots heard around the world. And as I always say, that wasn't Bobby Thompson's home run in 1951. That was up in Lexington, Concord in Massachusetts. So the war begins. And then we had the Declaration of Independence in 1776 on July 4th, as we know. And then Congress got kicked out of Philadelphia on September 30th, 1777. So, there's where it started in York County. You might say, well, why don't you have the Articles of Confederation at the apex there? The Congress ratifies treaties with France. But that was the apex. That was a turning point in the war. We wouldn't have won that war without France. But to win France on as an ally, we needed a constitution, the Articles of Confederation. We needed a victory on the battlefield. And we got that in Saratoga during the visit when Congress was here. So we got both of those things, and the negotiators, Ben Franklin and the negotiator for America and France, said, "Oh, hey, we have a constitution. We can cooperate. These 13, wayward sons and daughters can get together and become a family, and we can also win on the battlefield." So we got the treaties with France, and then Congress left here on June 27th because the British Army had left Philadelphia and was going to New York, and so the Army was now revitalized. This was the Valley Forge we're talking about here, and we know that winter was a struggle. Then they strutted after that, the Army did, and followed the British into New Jersey and fought it to a draw at the Battle of Monmouth, and the rest is history. So and I wanted to call attention to this, which I think really probably gets to the heart of what you're asking. Richard Henry Lee was really a key person, maybe an underrated statesman. And he put forth a resolution to Continental Congress, which is akin to Congress today, saying, we need 3 things if we're going to be a nation, and if we're going to have our independence. We need a Declaration of Independence, we need a call to form foreign alliances, and we need a plan for confederation. So we got the Declaration of Independence. There's 3 different committees formed. We got the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. At the same time, there was a draft going on of the Articles of Confederation, the Plan for Confederation. So that was done shortly after the Declaration was signed. And then and you can see that York is involved in 2 of those 3 things. The Articles of Confederation, our first Constitution, was adopted here in York the next year. And then once we had that, as we've already talked about, then we had the Foreign Alliance. We could get France on board. So you can see that York County housed Congress at a critical time. We got 2 of the 3 things done that needed to be done, to win the war and to win our independence.
So I want to get to a question in the chat then in a moment, Jim, but you beg a question here. So York Countyans were heavily involved in helping to achieve those milestones. And you touched on that. Could you also maybe elaborate on that a little bit, but talk a little bit about the leadership style of Richard Henry Lee? How was he able to manage this? You had 64 delegates, most of which were not here, and it was sporadic attendance throughout, but he was able to lead that group and get these milestones accomplished.
Yeah, he was one of the leaders, and he was a Southerner. He was of the Lee family. He was a second cousin of Robert E. Lee, and so he was of that family of Virginia. But he was educated in London or England, and he had strong family ties to the North. So he kind of straddled the Northerners, the Adams, and the Southerners, the Henry Lornes, and other. In those days, and maybe even today, he had divisions between the North and the South, and he kind of straddled those divisions. He was a very effective orator and was well respected, and he had you could tell by his correspondence he was very good at winning his points and bringing people together. Very underrated. And I wonder sometimes, and this isn't just today, but I wonder in these times of unanimous vote, party line votes, that we don't need more Richard Henry Lees, who could work between, or could work across the aisle, and a true statesman. Now he had his contradictions, as we all do. He enslaved people. And this gets complicated and maybe off the point, but many of the delegates here in York, they dealt with matters back at their plantations, really from the floor of Congress. They would sit there after hours and so forth and write correspondence back home to their overseers and so forth. Richard Henry Lee was against Atlantic slave trade, and he was also against slavery, but he lived with the unfortunate tension that he had to feed his family. So he didn't have any other wealth beside his plantation, and he couldn't fed his family and so forth without having enslaved people to do that. So I think it is nowadays. People will say, "Oh, I did it for my family," and that's what he said. I'm not sure that's always really convincing, but so he really was one of these contradictory, or someone that kind of voted one way but lived in tension in a kind of a tension. Nowadays, we would call someone, I think we would tend to dismiss someone like that as a hypocrite and just discount them. In those days, they recognized that as a weakness, but they didn't bathwater, you might say. That might raise a lot more questions, but that's really, really the way that I see Richard Henry Lee and others as well, not just him.
So Jim, we did, or Caroline, you.
So we do have a question in the chat about formatting of your book. One of the folks joining us this evening said the layout was a little confusing to them, and they realized it's like a newspaper layout, but unlike a newspaper, which tells you what the page or what page the feature continues on. They were having a little trouble trying to sort out where it continued. Do you have any tips on how to read the layout?
Yeah, that I tried something different. Instead of using footnotes, and I used the rail idea. This wasn't really a journalistic thing as much as I tried to put the narrative. Uh, I tried to tell a regular narrative. So just read the main parts of the pages or just regular narratives. And the rail, and so that should be a continuous narrative throughout the entire book. And then the rails, I call them the rails, the thinner part to the side, are just is just information to add to the narrative, and they're pretty well lined up on the same page as the narrative is. So, but sometimes this is probably what got confusing. It appeared on the next page, for example, just because of space and so on. So I could see where that could be a little confusing. So just to read it, the narrative is the main part of the page, and then the exposition is in the rail. So that might be helpful.
Thanks for that. Jim, probably one of the most prominent Yorktownians at this time was James Smith. He was a member of Congress during their 1777-78 stay in Yorktown. Can you just give us a little bit about James Smith? Tell us about his contributions before, during, and after the Revolutionary War in this period.
Yeah, he was basically a country lawyer. He's born in Ireland and was in York, lived in York all of his adult life, at least. Not a lot is known about him, really. Nothing, no biographies have ever been written on him, at least a book form biography. All of his papers got lost in a fire near the end of his life. So there's not as much out on them as there are many other of these statesmen. He was a lawyer, and really his accomplishment was he was a member, he signed the Declaration of Independence, and he also was there at the time the Pennsylvania state constitution was adopted. He signed that as well. In terms of his statesmanship, he was more of a country lawyer. When you read the journals of Congress and the letters of the other delegates, he's not really visible. He was on some committees. He was here when Congress was here for some of the time, not all the time. So he must have been in Philadelphia or been in Lancaster with the state government at the time. So he was very active, but I'm not sure how effective he was. Interestingly, he was one of the oldest of all the delegates. He was his birthday's not known particularly. He was between 58 and 65 years of age, something like that. And the average age of all the delegates, I added them all up and did the math, is 44 years of age. So we really did have young men, in this case men, really forming the nation legislatively. This particular piece of art is one of 16 large-scale panels that are the History Center owns them, and they're in storage right now. But I'm sure they'll be brought out in times of the 250th anniversaries coming up. It shows James Smith in his law office, which is about where, I guess that's Fulton Bank, Drover's Bank on South George Street. You're looking out of his window and you're seeing the Center Square Courthouse where Congress met. It was a county courthouse, and it was vacant at the time. And so Congress came here and met here. And that snow that's falling is the same snow that fell in Valley Forge that particular winter. So this painting brought together all those elements. And I love this painting. And this also, these 16 panels and they were hung outside in 1927, which was the 150th of the articles. They're still in pretty remarkable shape. I'm sure they brought them in when it rained, but I guess you could say this really was the first Mural of York program in 1927. And this was one of those 16 murals.
And one of the other questions I was going to ask was, through your research, was there someone you uncovered that you wonder, why don't we know more about that person? Why don't more York Countyans know this person or that person? And maybe you could focus on those 16 portraits. Were there any folks that you uncovered through your research and preparing for this that you thought to yourself, well, these are pretty important to the history of York County, and I wish more people knew about them?
Yeah, that's uh, I tend to look at the townsfolks in that regard. I would like to know more about the people that lived here in that 9-month period. There's not really a lot left on the record about them. To learn about the statesmen, you can look at the Journals of Congress and look at their letters. Those are all online, and anybody can read them, and they're very, very interesting. But in terms of just the local people, we don't know a lot. But one local person I admire and wish I knew more about was a woman by the name of the widow Mimmons, who hosted Timothy Pickering, a border war member from Massachusetts. And he wrote about her, and he said that she would spend morning till night at her spinning wheel. And he said it's a modest wheel. He made a point of that. It's not an elaborate spinning wheel. It was whirling like the purring of a cat. And she was doing that from morning to night. And you think about it, why was she doing that? And I think that she was so hard at work because, number one, she probably had to make a living because work costs were high, and there's a lot of people in town chasing few goods, and so she needed the money. But also, she probably was doing work for the Defense Department, uniforms, things like that. So she was busy the whole time. Wish I knew more about her. Another key person is the Reverend Niesner, a Moravian pastor who kept a journal. So I feature him heavily in the book because that was a good source. So he wrote about everyday activities, and the Moravians are a pacifist bunch. And so he had to deal in his journal with those who were of his members that marched off to war. And then whenever the English were in town in Camp Security, the British prisoners were in Camp Security, he lamented that they were corrupting the morals of his congregation. So it gives you glimpses of what the people in town had to put up with in this 9-month period. We can think about the statesmen and all they gave up, and it was considerable. But what about the people in town? The men were away at war. The people running the town were the aged and the women and the children. And there were farms and farm animals. They had to, there's businesses to run, and there was a war going on. So it really was, you can see why in 1999, we kind of made the American Revolution the keynote of our history at that point. It was a total contribution from the community and the statesmen who were here.
You mentioned earlier about the Susquehanna River, and obviously it presented a natural barrier. But what were there other reasons that brought Congress to Yorktown?
Yeah, I'd list them here, and you can kind of read all that. It was a buffer. That was a big thing, and even late in the war, you can read the other types of things that went on here. And Valley Forge, I might note, is somewhere between Philadelphia and here, and that was part of the reason why Washington located the army in Valley Forge, was to have that buffer against Congress. But the river was a big deal, and even late in the spring of 1778, the Continental Congress commissioned some engineers to sound the river, to walk the river from Harrisburg all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay and do soundings and find out where a raiding party from a British raiding party could come across. And he said, Henry Lawrence, the president of Congress, said, if they just have a good cavalry troop, they can come here and take all of us. So they were very nervous about the British raid. So they went, and you can read their survey. They looked at all the ferry crossings, and where they finally concluded that the bridge could do the most impact would be come up the Chesapeake Bay, dock down there, and march up to York. They really wanted to invade York, because the rest of the ferry crossings and the fords you couldn't bring really much of an army across. So the river was very much of a barrier. And you can see the other reasons there off to the left.
Jim, the Articles of Confederation, I think most agree that that was our first constitution. How do you
Right.
how do you respond to that? And then I want to jump into a bit of a debate. Why isn't York considered? Some people consider it, but it's not officially considered the first capital of the United States. Why do you think that
And the
is?
first, yeah, this is, you want to build your history on solid, on solid facts, on a solid story, a true story. And the problem was about 1960, the promoters of York, the Chamber of Commerce and the tourism people said, why don't we promote this first capital claim? And it was a marketing ploy. And at the time it was controversial, but it stuck. So, so we really have based our American Revolution history on that idea that we're the first capital. But that's about all a lot of people know. We're the first capital, and that's not even a true claim. And let me explain why. The rationale for first capital was, and we could talk about this a lot. I'll try to be brief here. The first capital was that whenever we had whenever the Articles of Federation were adopted here, the Article 1 said the style of the democracy shall be the United States of America. So in our first Constitution, we say it's the United States of America. But what that disregards is several things. One is you can see the United States of America is in, I think my pointer can work here, says United States of America. That's in the Declaration of Independence. It was also on continental money, way before the Articles of Confederation. Here in 1776, you can see in the Journal of the Congress that in all continental commissions and other instruments where heretofore the words United Colony, sorry about that, has been used, the style shall be altered for the future to the United States. So there, Congress was in their official documents, we're talking about, we're called the United States. So the marketing people then said, well, it wasn't legal until the Articles of Federation was adopted here on November 15th, 1777. But really, the Articles of Federation didn't have the force of law until 1781, when the last state ratified them. So if by that logic, Philadelphia would be the first capital of the United States, because they became the force of law in Philadelphia whenever the last state ratified the Articles of Confederation. This is my interest here, that most people, June Lloyd, for example, will say we're the fourth capital. If you look at it chronologically, that makes sense. And Robert Fortenbaugh from Gettysburg College took a look at this, and he didn't think it's the first capital either. But the big thing that we need to look at here is that most of the outside world considers the Articles of Confederation as the first constitution. And there's kind of evidence there. The Library of Congress, the National Constitution Center, the National Archives, all talk about the Articles as the first constitution. So why are we stuck on the first capital stuff, which is a marketing thing? It's not based on fact. So I think that is changing. I don't know a single historian that's looking at this stuff nowadays that buys into the first capital idea. In 2002, in the celebration in 2002, in 2020, 2002, the 225th, we did a survey, 3 surveys, to try to figure whether the education was working. The 225th was very much an educational enterprise, and and so we drilled on. We talked about the first capital as being a spurious thing, but we talked more about the Articles of Confederation being the first constitution and the ideas behind the Articles of Confederation. So you can see in these 3 surveys by Paul Glepson that the Articles of Confederation, the understanding, the first response was it doubled, and the first capital declined, continued. And what was even more gratifying is those that said they do not know went down as well. So that, I hope we can, as these anniversaries come up, we can continue to measure in that way. So that's really quick. I'm glad to unpack any of that, but we need to build our history on really on, we all know this, on as solid a foundation as we can. First Capital just isn't a foundation.
In a recent newspaper article, you wrote that the Articles of Confederation feature ideas that demand our attention today. Can you talk a little bit more about that statement, and what were some of those ideas or ideals that the articles brought forth that you think would be worth us revisiting today?
Yeah, one of the things that when the articles were first drafted by John Dickinson, they were very much a Federalist document, which meant a strong central government. And then there's if you don't mind me, I'm going to click here to try to show you. This is the articles. This is how they actually worked on the Articles of Confederation. They took drafts and they printed them. So you can see here's a printed version here, because that way they're more legible and so on. And then each of the delegates had one of these printed versions right in front of them, and then they could notate them and annotate them and so on. And you can initially, Article 2 was it was a Federalist document, but then sometime in 1777, before Congress got here, they introduced a new Article 2, which was a states' rights document. Each state shall retain its sovereignty. So you change that clause, you change from a Federalist document to a states' rights document. And then the old Article 2 became, you can see, it became an Article 3. So you can actually see in real time, as it were, here's the provision they put in for a new Article 2, and here's Article 3 here. So they kind of demolished that strong federal government. So why do we care today? Well, you remember during COVID, depending on which president was in, the other side said the states ought to decide what to do with COVID. It shouldn't be a Federalist idea. So there is you have stuff about California demerging from the country, things like that. Those are all states' rights initiative. So states' rights has come back, in a big way. And of course, the states' rights was a big deal during the Civil War as well. So we could do well to understand in our first Constitution, we kind of flopped in a year period from a strong Federalist government document as the U.S. Constitution is that succeeded the Articles of Confederation. We flopped to a strong states' rights document, and in the end, the states' rights document couldn't carry us much further than through the war. We needed a stronger document known as the U.S. Constitution today. So that's really one of several things that, there's several other things you can kind of read in there. If you want to talk about them, we can. But I would just say that the thing that is important to know that Congress just didn't come here in September 30th and just kind of sit around and just take what they already had and then put it into a document. As you know, in any negotiations, you say the toughest issues to last, or the toughest issues kind of come up in the last part. So they had really three prickly issues. One of the issues was how to assess war costs. Do you assess the war costs according to population, which would mean enslaved people, or do you, which would include enslaved people, or do you assess war costs according to real estate value? Well, Congress honed in on real estate value there. In some ways, the U.S. Constitution went with per capita, and they included enslaved people at a 3/5 type of equation. And Congress didn't do that here in New York. They did it according to property. And then this thing that still goes on even today is, why should a small state have as much, like Maryland or even North Dakota have as much say in many ways as California? So they dealt with that, and they came up with that by just saying every state would have a vote. The U.S. Constitution, of course, dealt with that by having the same number of senators for every state, and then they had a per capita way of dealing with the U.S. House of Representatives. The Articles of Confederation, one of its weak unicameral. It only had one house. It didn't have a presidency, an executive branch. It didn't have a judiciary. All it had was a legislative branch. and only had one house, didn't have two houses. So they dealt with those two really big issues. They came down on the side of every state having one vote, and they did it according to property. Now, the third thing they dealt with was what they called the Western lands, which is really a state like Maryland, which is small geographically. They didn't really want to approve a document. They wanted the government to kind of define the Western lands. Virginia's land went all the way to the Ohio River. So Maryland looked at Virginia and said, wait, that's not fair. We want Congress to intervene, and we're not going to sign this document until Congress does something about that. They couldn't agree on that in York, so they said, you know what? We have 13 articles here. We need this document. France needs this document. We're just going to put that off until some other point. And they never really got to that. So and then Maryland ended up holding out until 1781, and that's whenever they ratified, the 13th state to ratify the Articles of Confederation. So that's a lot there. If anybody's any questions, feel free.
And Caroline did put a note in the chat there. If you do have questions, we're down to about 15 minutes. So please add them to the chat. Jim, you commented that Congress didn't just sit around looking for things to do. They wrestled with the Articles of Confederation, but then there was also the incident of the Conway Cabal that challenged General Washington's leadership. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that was dealt with by Congress at the time?
Yeah, that's something, as you do these things, you become more interested in some of the stories more than others. And this story never really has interested me much because I don't really, although I've studied it, I'm conversant on it. But I just don't know that it was ever that big of a deal. Really, what happened was that Washington wasn't winning on the battlefield, and Horatio Gates was winning. He won in the Battle of Saratoga, which we already talked about was a big deal. It helped bring France on board. So what Congress did is they said, we need a board of war to allegedly help Washington, but it really kind of undermined Washington in many ways. So they created a board of war here in York, and Horatio Gates came to York County. We are aware of the Gates House and Plow Tavern. That's reportedly where he stayed. So he headed the board of war here, which in some ways undermined Washington. So one of the things that is interesting about this story was it was a loose-knit confederation of people that opposed Washington. And as Lafayette came here, he didn't come here to deal with the Conway Cabal. He came here to get a commission from Congress because he wanted to lead an incursion into Canada. He wanted to be a military commander. So he came here, and at that point, the Conway Cabal was supposedly at its peak or was underway, and so there was this famous toast that's controversial that took place in the second floor of the Gates House, where he saluted Washington, gave a toast to Washington, thereby signifying France's support of Washington. And as the story goes, that the Conway Cabal lost steam after that, but it brought Lafayette to York, and some people wonder whether that could have ever been true. I tend to believe that the toast could be true and is true. He wrote it in his diary some decades afterwards. So some people say, well, it's too far removed. He didn't write about it at the time, but there's no reason why he would make that story up. And so he came here, got his commission, went up to Canada. There's no troops there awaiting him. The Board of War lost a lot of luster because they didn't support him. And the whole Conway Cabal eventually dissipated. And if it ever was a factor to begin with.
And if you want to look back in our archive, we did discuss that whole incident in length several programs ago. Jim, in addition to all of this, we also housed prisoner of war camps around York, in and around York. We had the county 2-story jail in South George and East King Street, and then also Camp Security. Can you talk a little bit about those two facilities?
Yeah, it's focused mainly because of time on camp security. I think this is a big deal. And as we talk about the 250th anniversary of the Articles of the Declaration and of the treaties with France, I think we need to also bundle in to that the 250th of the advent of camp security in Springetts Ferry Township. It was a prisoner of war camp that was created here to house British prisoners of war. And so it was a major camp. In fact, some of the prisoners were prisoners from the Battle of Saratoga from 1777. Here we are in 1781, and they're still incarcerated. So they came here from Charlottesville, and they came here and were put into a stockade. In recent months, recent years, there's been a valiant attempt to try to find where that stockade was. And so they just in the past summer, they found post holes. They know now kind of where the stockade was. So that's an amazing discovery and should be part of our celebrations that we have going on. But the thing that, to really get at the heart of your question, as far as Camp Security goes, is that the prisoners were put under parole. And so they didn't, some of the prisoners could walk around within a certain mile radius of the fort. These weren't German prisoners. These weren't German mercenaries. They were elsewhere, even on farms around the area. These were British prisoners. And they were walking around town. And as I said before, their encounters with the townspeople wasn't positive. And think about that for a second. Here we are, we've sent our loved ones off to war to fight these guys. Here they are walking around our streets. And we had a similar situation in World War II, where we had German prisoners of war that came here to Stewartstown and were incarcerated there, and then they worked in the canneries and the orchards. Again, we had the enemy in our midst, and so it was a tough pill to swallow. And so that's why I think camp security really needs to be studied and bundled into all these celebrations.
And we have a question over in our chat that I think takes us back pages 168, 169 in your book. But can you give us an idea of York County's economy and demographics during this 9-month period?
The demographic, you broke up a little bit. The demographics of York
Of
at the
York
time,
and the economy as well.
Yeah. There's a doctoral dissertation by Paul Doutrick from York College. He essentially looked at York during this this 8-year period, the American Revolution. He said the American Revolution really turned York from a German peasant town into a town with a market economy. And where you went from a barter system to something more like we know it today. So the war was helpful in that way. But there was a lot of people would maybe envision the York during the American Revolution as looking like this, which is a common portrayal of York. But really, this York looked something like this off to the left. This is in 1801, so this is 25 years after Continental Congress was here, and so York was really in the edge of the beyond. It was a frontier town, like you see on Hollywood sets, and we had brick buildings as opposed to wooden buildings on those Hollywood sets, but it was a sparsely populated town on the edge of the frontier. So here we had these statesmen that came here used to Boston and such places, and they came here to settle into this town. So again, they needed to live here, and a lot of the farmers and so forth were off at war, and so there was a scarcity, and so the economy just had to manage one way or another. But in the end, according to Paul Doutrick's work, it came out ahead. Wars can do that. Civil War primed us for the Industrial Revolution. World War II got us out of the Great Depression, some would say. This changed York's economy in many ways.
And it looks like we have an additional question. How was John Dickinson viewed in York since he didn't sign the Declaration of Independence? Was he still respected?
Yeah, I've read all the letters of those who are here, and they are very interesting. There's a lot of them. I never saw much, and I can't recall any connections with John Dickinson in those letters. He he, of course, drafted the Articles of Confederation to begin with. So we can thank him for that, even though it was changed, as we talked about, from a Federalist document to state. So he, even today, he's viewed, because he didn't sign the Declaration, with a little bit of suspicion. But we tend to forget his letters from a Pennsylvania farmer before the war kind of led up to the buildup of the war. He was patriotic in many ways. There's reasons why he didn't sign the Declaration of Independence, but he was a major statesman. But to answer the question, I can't give you any information that I can recall from what I think he was almost a non-entity at that point. So he wasn't a factor in discussions and so forth. One thing I'll mention that he did do, if I can find it without making you seasick again here. One of the things that is that first Articles of Confederation was, it had language in there initially from Dickinson, who wasn't a Quaker, but he had Quakers in his household, was influenced by Quakers, and he had inclusive language in there, like his or her, his and her, rather than their. So that was in the first draft. You can go online and find those drafts, but that didn't get very far as far as Congress goes. So there's a lot to Dickinson, but in terms of what he did during that 9-month period, he wasn't here, and he wasn't a factor in these discussions. He wasn't here to see through the document that he originally drafted.
It does look like we have one last question from our book club members this evening. How important was Lewis Miller's artwork in assembling your book, Jim?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. Now, Lewis Miller was born in the late 1700s, so he didn't witness the American Revolution. But he had a photographic memory, and he, as a young boy, he saw these veterans of the American Revolution. He saw them; some of them were suffering still from the wounds that they sustained during the war. So we've seen a couple of his right here off to the left. That's a Lewis Miller drawing right there. So I used that in the book, and anything else. There's a portrait he has of George Washington. Anything else he had that touched on the American Revolution. And I'll just say quickly that all the books that I've done, you can think of them somewhat as an index of Lewis Miller. Because if I did a Civil War, my East of Gettysburg Civil War book, I used everything in there that he did on the Civil War. So if you want to see what he did on the wars, you can include in the American Revolution. You can just look at the books as a kind of index. So he's a very valuable documentarian for any author.
To wrap us up tonight, Jim, in 2026, 2027, we hit the 250th anniversary of the Declaration and the Articles. What are you most looking forward to with that celebration and that milestone?
Yeah, and again, the 250th of the treaties with France and the 250th of Camp Security, all those bundled. It really is a bunch of very big anniversaries coming up. We also have York County's 275th anniversary in 2024, which is something to think about. So we have all these anniversaries coming up, and these give you a time to really gather yourself and really talk about these moments in history. And as we talked about, we have a big part of this American Revolution story here, but overlaid on that is all the projects that are coming on board that are cultural and historical in nature. And these are projects that you see on the screen here that are already underway or even done, like the Yorktown renovation, for example, and all these museums and cultural things. These are all done in the last 5 years. But these are some, let's see about, I put them all on one slide. There's something like 30 some projects that are going to stand up here in the next during the anniversary period that we've talked about here. And you can read them there. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to talk about them. But let's don't forget the History Center Steam Plant Museum is going to be opening in the old Med Ed building in 2024, just as one example. Christmas Attucks History and Cultural Center is opening probably somewhere around 2025. So, we have these major museums. One of the things that's on there is called Hard Bargains. I don't know if that's what they'll finally call it, but that's an outdoors installation that focuses on the Articles of Confederation. So, like a monument to the Articles of Confederation in that time frame. But you can see all these many other events, and many of these events can be tied to the American Revolution. Like Crispus Attucks Center, for example, their new history center and cultural center, is named after one of the guys killed in the Boston Massacre, which really, and some people think, was the start of the build up to the American Revolution. So there's all these ties to many of these projects that can, that we can use to bundle with these anniversaries. So this really is the golden age of York County history studies and York County history. We have these, in 1976, we had to build that colonial courthouse down on the banks of the replica that History Center runs today on the banks of the Cadors. We had to build that especially for that occasion. But look at this. We have all this stuff being built even apart from these anniversaries, but they can all be bundled into these anniversaries. Or maybe not all of them, but most of them can be bundled into these anniversaries. So it really is a wonderful opportunity here, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk about all this great stuff tonight. Don't forget the arc here. The nation came together during this 9-month period, struggling to strutting, coming in without a constitution, without a win on the battlefield, without treaties with France, leaving here with all three of those. And the rest, as I say, is history.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you so much for joining us, Jim, as our author. I think we all had a great time, and this is a great starting point for some folks' journeys into getting ready for the 250th. And I look forward to collaborating with you and some other folks in the community in enriching our history and showcasing it for future folks to see. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. This concludes our program for this evening.